Probably the most obvious way in which the invention or the bringing about of digital technology has shown us the difference between people is what has been called the digital divide. And there are a few ways in which the digital divide has been formulated in a few years, but the most obvious one has been a generational divide between people who are born in a generation that uses the digital technology and people who are not. And of course, there have been several cartoons over the years kind of illustrating that fact. That started with cell phones, and whether or not those cell phones were a new invention during the time when it was invented, it was very much perceived as this fundamentally new generation that was coming through over the years. And as that kind of echoes a few themes that we have mentioned in the past in this particular class, of course, the fact that the mobile phone is this new technology that is kind of an extension of ourselves, but eventually it actually became a theme for a entire class of people that is somewhat uh, derided as the millennials, essentially. And millennials are this weird kind of generation that are identified partly by a point in time, and of course the one of the most common ways to formulate millennials is people who essentially remember when 9/11 happened, who have this picture, I guess, of the terrorist attacks of September 11. But the other way in which millennials are typically pictured is this generation that is constantly using one device or the other. And of course, cell phones are widely predating millennials, and the cartoons that I was just showing a second ago are not designed for millennials, but for some reason, millennials became the flagship generation of the digital world. And so, in as much as there is such a thing as millennials, and the name itself kind of leads itself to the digital enterprise, if you will, right? As the new millennium, the future of some kind of time or another, and identifying a population group by this kind of futuristic term as opposed to baby boomers, the Great Generation, or Generation X, whatever it is, kind of foreshadows a very specific group of people, I suppose. And the phones here are kind of an important theme for us because they appeared in last week's reading from Pink, mostly because the cell phones were that kind of early adopted feature of digital technology, and one that has spread a lot faster than any of the previous technologies that existed. And the digital divide is also illustrated through these ethnographic accounts from last week's reading. After her studies, Monica's found a job in an export house on the outskirts of Delhi. However, after only 5 months, Monica resigned her job because of her mother's constant surveillance. She would call her on her mobile several times a day, and if she didn't answer, she would call the office phone. So the landline and the mobile phone, both of them being used as a way by the previous generation to keep up with this new generation. Her mother considers this her duty, commenting that young girls need to be protected. There are so many distractions, and we cannot allow her to go astray. Monica found her mother's oversight extremely difficult and said that her smartphone connection with the outside world stopped her from going mad. Constantly online through her phone, she used a range of social media sites, including Facebook, Orkut, Twitter, and Skype. She had made flirtations on Facebook and had over 400 friends, many of them unknown to her offline. She observed, "Of course, Amma does not know that I am up on the phone. She thinks that I'm texting and gets annoyed at times, but that is it. She does not know internet or Facebook." Monica knew that her mother would prohibit the use of the phone if she knew that what she did, but for her, it was a way of managing or circumventing the severe restriction placed on her in what she considered to be a harmless way. And so the phone itself, of course, becomes a handheld device that has apps and that has a much larger connection to the internet. And of course, that is a very sensible difference from the mobile phone as it exists in the imaginary of, keeping people in contact through this uh, cell phone system that essentially you call one person and you know what person is calling you by some kind of identifier, as opposed to the smartphone, which has access to the strangers and the world at large. So here in this extract, you have an illustration of how much the phone can change somebody's existence and can extend their world outside of a managing of these connections, that this person has a connection with their mom through their cell phone and at the same time has a connection with the outside phone world through the same cell phone, but using them for two different purposes. And in that context, of course, you need some kind of skill, I suppose, or some kind of a compartmentalization of your activity to make sure that those different parts of existence are not crossing over with one another. In this case, since her mother does not know about the other world that exists out there of Facebook and the such, then obviously that is an easy way to keep those worlds separate. And that being said, if you are thinking of the amount of time that is being spent on the internet and the amount of time that is being spent on the phone, there is obviously another pretty big difference here, because your online conversation could last forever and ever, and sometimes not necessarily you know, subsequent. In other words, you can send a message and get a response 2 days later, as opposed to a phone conversation, which is more limited in time. And essentially, if it lingers on too long, there are weird consequences to that. So different generations, of course, different devices and techniques as well. And on top of that, a different approach to how the world is being created and how those connections are being maintained. And in this sense here, the digital divide means very much a completely different attitude towards these technologies, as much as a different attitude towards the whole connected by these technologies as a result. Now, the digital divide itself, the term was coming especially from the world of economics. In this report from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a worldwide intergovernmental organization that connected most of the Western world with some industrializing countries in the 60s. The digital divide referred to a different pace at which those different countries would be able to connect through the internet and through these new technologies. So the term digital divide refers to the gap between individuals, household, businesses, and geographic areas at different socioeconomic levels with regard both to their opportunities to access information and communication technologies, ICTs, and to their use of the internet for a wide variety of activities. The digital divide reflects various differences among and within countries. The ability of individuals and businesses to take advantage of the internet varies significantly across the OECD area, as well as between OECD and non-member countries. Access to basic telecommunication infrastructures is fundamental to any consideration of the issue as it proceeds and is more widely available than access to and use of the internet. So again, kind of a nice and all-encompassing definition here, but there is a difference between individuals that have a digital connection and individuals who don't, much as there is a difference between the households that have a connection to digital world and those who don't, and also in the businesses, and also at the geographical level, of course, to a much larger extent. So having accessibility to the infrastructure, and that could include the device themselves as much as the internet as an infrastructure, the internet access. So having the phone, the computer, the internet access, the lines that allow for these to happen, maybe at different parts of the day. We mentioned net cafes last week. Those things are open at different points in time. Actually, I may be getting ahead of myself here. I think net cafes are coming up later. Sorry, this is the internet. The time is moving in weird fashion. It also has something to do with money, of course, because those things are not cheap. At least in the 2000s, they were definitely very pricey. Today, you can find an affordable alternative to most of these, and whether or not those alternatives are good enough or whether they are a status symbol are another part of this question. Of course, if you have a old phone, an old computer, you may not have the same level of access or the same level of recognition. Let's say if you're playing video games, for example, the newest video games require the newest hardware to function. The oldest video games may have a function on the internet still, but they will have somewhat of a lesser audience, maybe fewer people, or maybe some kind of diehard people who are much, much, much better than anybody else because they have been playing for years and years. And so that also involves factors such as age, gender, racial, linguistic background, of course, because being able to access the internet means sometimes knowing how English works, and that's not always possible to everyone. If you have a local infrastructure for the internet, that also means being able to communicate across that, and that is somewhat of a divide in and of itself. So in this connection with the digital world, there is a much larger aspect of the matching between people and their machines and the machines with the larger context in which they are, which becomes a matter of identity, which is the question that is our topic for this week. And we have mentioned identity partly in the past as well, and this is another cartoon explaining, exemplifying this conversation where on the internet nobody knows you're a dog. Now, of course, this is a joke. This is not supposed to be taken seriously, but in and of itself, there is a conversation to be had about whether or not a person is identifiable through the internet. Of course, there are ways in which you can have your identity obscured. And in other words, if you are talking to a person through the internet, you may not know where they live, what their living conditions are, what device they are using, etc. And those things are more or less important to your knowledge. But you may also, through your knowledge of the world, through the knowledge of the internet, be able to make sense of who they are. Maybe if their English is not as perfect as yours, or maybe if they use British English instead of American English, those things would be visible through text on the internet. The kinds of memes that they are posting and the kind of content that they are relating to, those would be also related to a larger economic context. If they are watching the latest movies, listening to the latest music, if they are making references to TV shows that you know or don't know, all those things are markers of identity that would be visible or identifiable. And in the context of this particular cartoon here, if you were a dog on the internet, I would say that, someone would know because you would talk about dog things, which is not the same as knowing the cool TikTok dances or whatever it is that people do on the internet these days. And talking like a Doge, for example, or eventually talking mostly about bacon and treats, those things that dogs do, which would kind of lead you to make sense of their identity in a way that is a little bit more straightforward than a thing on the other side of a computer or a thing on the other side of a cell phone. And that's also taking into account the fact that a dog would have to type things on a keyboard, which is both a funny thing to think about and also a reality that may have some kind of relevance to this conversation.